Some people leave behind stories, others leave behind miracles, but few, like Padre Pio, leave behind both. Before the world knew him as Padre Pio, he was simply Francesco. Born in 1887 in a small Italian village, his childhood was humble. The son of devout Catholics, he spent his early years tending sheep rather than sitting in a classroom. But from the beginning, there was something different about him. From the time he could speak, little Francesco saw things others couldn't. He spoke of angels. He had visions of Jesus and Mary. But with his gifts came great responsibilities. He was plagued by strange illnesses, fevers with no medical explanation, and deep physical suffering. While other children played, he fasted. While others slept, he meditated and prayed for hours. He was only 5 years old when he knew he would give his life to God. At 15, he took his first steps toward a life of total devotion, joining the Capuchin Franciscan friars and taking the name Pio. His days were filled with prayer, fasting, and study. His health, however, was fragile. At times, his suffering was so intense that doctors had no explanation. But through it all, he held on to one thing: his faith. In 1910, despite his frail health, he became a priest. But his trials had only begun. The world was at war, and like many young men, he was drafted into military service in 1915, during World War I. His frail body could not withstand the brutal conditions, and he spent more time in hospitals than on the battlefield, suffering from lung infections, fevers, and pain no doctor could explain. He was soon discharged. But something had changed in him. The suffering of those around him, wounded soldiers, grieving families, deepened his empathy. He carried that with him for the rest of his life. And in 1918, something happened that defied explanation. While praying after Mass, he was overwhelmed by a vision of Christ's passion. When he awoke, his hands, feet, and side bore wounds identical to those of Jesus on the cross. The stigmata, both a sign from heaven and a cross to bear. The wounds bled and burned for 50 years, baffling doctors and scientists alike. At first, he tried to hide them. He wrapped his hands, avoided attention. But the scent of flowers filled the air whenever he was near. And soon, the people noticed. Some called it a miracle, others a lie. And the scrutiny only grew. Even within the church, not everyone was convinced. He was investigated, silenced, and at one point, forbidden from celebrating Mass publicly. But the people who met him knew something beyond the ordinary was at work. He obeyed. He never defended himself. He simply accepted the suffering, saying, "God is a father. He never disturbs the joy of his children, except to prepare them for a greater joy." Despite restrictions, people traveled from all over the world to see him. Why? Because they knew Padre Pio was not an ordinary priest. He would look into your eyes and tell you things no one else knew. He would remind you of sins you had forgotten, calling people back to confession after decades away. Many tried to test him, only to be left in tears as he spoke their deepest truths. One man, a well-known atheist, entered the confessional just to mock him. But as soon as he sat down, Padre Pio said, "You have not been to confession in 30 years. You cursed your mother on her deathbed. Repent before it is too late." The man trembled. How could he have known? He left a believer. Around him, miraculous healings, visions, prophecies, countless testimonies poured in. But perhaps the most astonishing story was that of Paulina, a woman declared dead, only to be brought back to life after Padre Pio's prayers. The line between heaven and earth seemed thinner around him. Then there was bilocation, Padre Pio appearing in places he had never visited. Soldiers in World War II reported seeing him in the sky, guiding their planes to safety. A bishop in Rome, hundreds of miles away, swore Padre Pio appeared in his room, warning him of a danger that later came true. Coincidence? Or something beyond this world? But Padre Pio's true legacy wasn't just in the miracles. It was in his devotion to prayer. Pray, hope, and don't worry, he constantly said, and lived by it. His devotion to the Virgin Mary was unshakable. He carried the rosary always, praying it countless times a day. He also continued hearing confessions for 12 hours a day, celebrating Mass with tears streaming down his face. His love for the sick led to the creation of one of Italy's most renowned hospitals. His spiritual children grew in numbers. Even popes sought his counsel. He was a man whose heart beat to the rhythm of God's will. After a lifetime of suffering and service, he was called to the Most Holy. At this time, something inexplicable happened. The wounds, the stigmata that had bled for 50 years, vanished. Not a scar remained on his body. Surely, the crowds at his funeral were beyond counting. The church that once doubted him finally recognized him publicly. And in 2002, Pope John Paul II, who had once received a miracle from him, declared him a saint. But the interrogations remains. Was he a miracle worker, or just a man with a little more faith than ordinary? Perhaps he was both. Padre Pio's story isn't just about miracles, it's about surrender. It's about trusting God even when the world doubts. It's about embracing suffering, knowing it has meaning. And perhaps holiness isn't about the extraordinary. It's about ordinary souls saying yes to God in all circumstances. If this story has sparkled a little faith in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, subscribe, and join us as we continue to uncover the lives of saints who changed the world. Until next time, keep the faith.